Welcome back. I'm Shane, and this is Relative Time. Today we're going to take a look at the Iridium Torpedo, which is a vintage-inspired diver that will be launching some point soon on Kickstarter. While the Torpedo is the first watch for Iridium, the brand is connected to Audric, and they had a pretty successful Kickstarter last year with the Seaborn 500-meter diver. Now, this is a prototype that was lent into the channel, but they also mentioned that if they are successful, they will send me a full production model later on. Yet the main reason I mentioned that it's a prototype is that there are already a number of changes that they have planned, which includes the crystal, the caseback, the buckle, and the lume. I'll touch on each of these as we go on, but for now, let's just get to it. While the Torpedo is supposed to be a vintage-style diver, they are going for more of a contemporary size. So you're looking at a width of 42mm and a slightly longer lug-to-lug of 51, as well as it's a little bit thick at 14mm. Now, I wouldn't exactly say that this is a beefy watch, but it is a little bit of a larger platform to wear. Luckily, the lugs do curve down a bit to compensate for that. Then combine that with a nice fully articulating Jubilee-style bracelet, and it's fairly comfortable and balanced on my wrist. Although some of that thickness can be attributed to the 300 meters of water resistance and a double-domed sapphire crystal. The Torpedo also has a bit of weight to it. I think it's about 175 grams on its bracelet. Although this might change as well, as they are planning to change the class, but we'll talk more about that later. But as it is right now, it's definitely a weight you can feel on your wrist, but nothing that isn't manageable throughout the day. The overall case design here is pretty standard for a diver. The top and sides have a nice linear brushing, as well as a polished chamfered edge that runs down the side of each lug. And as a bonus, the watch will be treated with an additional scratch-resistant coating. On the rear, you have a closed stainless caseback with a circular brushing. It is complete with all the particulars and a lightly laser-etched Torpedo logo for kind of a cool touch. Now, one change that they mentioned is that they are going to reverse this design, just to make the etching a little bit deeper. Now, while the overall finishing is pretty good, one thing I noticed is that on the bottom, right where the lugs curve down, there is a little bit of a sharper edge to it, and that is something you can feel as you handle the watch. Back to the front and on the right, you have a screwed down crown, and it also has a loomed logo. For this particular design without any crown guards, I think the crown here is just about a perfect size. It's not very tall, but it's just tall enough that it's always easy to grab a hold of and use. Plus, I think the knurling matches that on the bezel. Now, the bezel is a matching stainless, and that's also all loomed up. It's 120 click and unidirectional, plus the action itself is pretty good with a nice audible and tactile response. There is a touch of backplay here, but whatever mechanism they're using, as soon as you let the bezel go, it snaps right back to where it needs to be. From a design standpoint, the larger loomed markers on the bezel really stand out, which I think makes it just a little bit more functional and easy to use. But the downside of this is that the stainless steel bezel does tend to blend into the background of the case. And since that bezel really doesn't stand out on its own, that just winds up putting more focus on the crystal and the dial as a whole. Iridium's goal with the Torpedo is to give the watch a vintage look, and part of that is done by giving it a domed crystal with really rounded edges. And in that regard, I think they have succeeded, and nicely so. But I think they went a little too aggressive with the curvature of the crystal. Sometimes a little bit of distortion can really enhance the design. It just kind of depends. And I really wouldn't be surprised if some people really love this look, as everything under that crystal looks like it's underwater. But for me, this is just too much, and I find it really distracting. I mean, this is almost like a funhouse mirror kind of curvature. The rounded edge starts about halfway through the indices, so everything beyond that point is just a bit off. I mean, heck, looking straight down at the watch, you can't even tell that there's a chapter ring beyond those indices. It's really that bad. So this is definitely an issue, but it's an issue that Iridium is already aware of, as it's been raised by other reviewers. So they already have plans to change it, and they're changing it from one with more of a shallower beveled edge than a rounded one. So that should improve the clarity. And they actually sent me some pictures to share that show off that change. There's still a little bit of a distortion here, but at least you can still see that chapter ring. Now, as far as I know, this is the biggest change that they're planning on making, and I think they are going in the right direction. But It's always a risk when a brand makes these bigger changes before a launch and they don't send out an updated prototype to reviewers, as I can only really evaluate what I have in my hand. Plus, they only really get one chance to make a first impression with all of you. So this might not have been the right decision, but just kind of bear all this in mind. Anyway, let's just move on to the dial itself. I'm not sure how many different colorways they're planning, but this is obviously the black dial version. It has a nice glossy black with a very subtle sunburst effect. Now, even though you might not be able to see it, there is a chapter ring at the very edge of the dial painted on in white. Then moving inward, we hit the hour indicators, and they're a mixture of dots and diamonds. They all have a nice laser-cut metallic frame to them, and then filled with white lume. It's a more unusual set of indices here, but one that I think looks pretty good against the black dial. And I think the green dial version they're planning looks rather interesting. The handsets are a set of arrows for the hour and minute, and then this long orange lollipop for the second hand. Just like the indices, they look pretty good with the design. You also have a standard amount of text on the dial and a frame date at the 3, so not much else to talk about here. Overall, it's a pretty clean and simple design, very readable and very easy to use. Now, I think the diamond indices here would work better with a more maybe geometric looking handset, say like a snowflake. And while I normally prefer a watch with a date just for everyday use, I think with this design and those diamond shaped indices, it would look better without that date. As it is now, it just kind of feels asymmetrical and kind of off balance. Let's move on to the lume, and this is one area that Iridium did a good job with. There's a nice blue BGW9 on the dial, hands, and bezel. Looks great initially, and has some decent staying power, which you can see in this comparison test as the hands last just about as long as a Seiko Turtle. However, the dial itself is just a little bit better and lasts just a little bit longer. So overall the prototype has good lume, but they also mentioned that they're going to improve it, so hopefully they can get the hands to last just as long as the dial, or a little bit of an extra kick. Now as for the movement, we have a Miyota 9015, and this is becoming one of my favorites when it comes to affordable watches. As it's a high beat movement with a 42-hour power reserve as well as hacking and hand winding, it is a step up from the standard workhorse Seiko NH35s. The rotor is a little louder than its Swiss counterparts, but for the price, it's hard to beat. One of the Torpedo's biggest strengths is in its bracelet. This is their take on a Jubilee-style bracelet, which is fully articulating and has 5 different sections, as well as it should be treated with the same scratch-resistant coating. The outside of each link has a linear brushing, which is then followed by 2 that are highly polished, and 1 more brush section that's sandwiched in between. It's a gorgeous looking bracelet, and the quality actually reminds me of something you would get from Strapcode. It has solid end links, solid links, and it starts at 22 but then tapers down to 20 at the clasp. The only problem I have with this bracelet is one that's getting replaced. The prototype has a nice milled clasp, but it's a friction release and not a push button. However, they already have plans to change it into a ratcheting diver's extension style clasp, which gives you the option to continuously adjust it throughout the day just to get that perfect fit. Now, it is pretty hard to judge it without seeing it, but generally those ratcheting style clasps are going to be a little bit longer and a little bit heavier. So for some that might not be worth it, but for me it's usually worth the trade-off. Finally, let's talk value. Now, when these launch on Kickstarter, they should be going for $399. I'm not sure what the final retail price will be, but $399 seems pretty good. Build quality is one of the Torpedo's biggest strengths. You're getting a good case with an anti-scratch coating, great bracelet, Miyota 9015, sapphire, and good lume. This seems to be a watch that went through the numbers and checks off all the boxes on what you might want. Now, for a comparison, you can look at a number of other divers out there with a Miyota 9015 movement, such as the Zelos Mako 3 or the recent Zelos Blacktip, and both of those had a launch price of $425 and a retail price of $499, as well as the Axios flagship also at $499. So, considering everything you're getting, I think $399 is a pretty good value for the Torpedo, which might be the bigger story here. In a lot of ways, the design here is fairly safe. The case design is rather standard, and that just leaves the dial as the only element to give this watch a real sense of visual identity. Yet I think the real story here, or maybe the real takeaway here, is the build quality and the value that this watch represents. However, is that enough to help the Torpedo really stand out in an already crowded market? And for that, I'm honestly not sure. The Torpedo has a familiar enough vibe to it, yet the dial and the crystal are just different enough that you want to take a second look. So for those that find comfort in that familiarity and really like the dial design, the quality is there and it is a pretty good price. Yet for me personally, I think there are a lot more interesting watches out there, even if they aren't quite the bargain. But what do you think about the Iridium Torpedo? Let me know down below. Is it something interesting or just another microbrand diver? And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Till next time.